Hi, so this evening we are here with Professor Kehinde Andrews, author of Back to Black. We would like to start talking, well, on this section we're talking about the 16th and 17th century, and we're really kind of looking at you for your knowledge basis. What are your thoughts on that time period?
Well, it's an interesting time period. The 16th and 17th century is really, particularly the 17th century, is when you start to get this kind of academic, intellectual justification of white supremacy, of racism, and you can see that like where we are today is really heavily framed by what happened in that period. Because up until then, the differences in terms of the so-called races, it wasn't necessarily biology. It was the church was defining difference. And that was largely about what religion you were. So the idea that, there are like different races of people who are genetically, biologically different, who should be treated differently because of their body was around before then, but really starts to become solid then. And those are the categories which we still have today.
And, we're talking about those kind of stereotypes that they put together. I mean, how were they integrated into society? Because there was, looking at, I think it was Queen Elizabeth, that initially there was a point where she was saying, we're not happy about this slavery thing. We don't need this slavery. We're not happy about this. And then it was within a couple of years, she totally changed her mind about, I think once the money started coming in. Yeah.
Because that's it. Because also, the UK was a bit later on in terms of getting involved in slavery. It doesn't get involved until 16th century, whereas Portugal, Portugal, Spain are like the earliest slave traders. England does get involved later, and it is Queen Elizabeth, right, who launches the first sanctioned slave trade, slave ship voyage on the slave ship Jesus, which should also tell us something, with John Hawkins. And it really is the money. I mean, it is the wealth. It was so lucrative what the Portuguese and the Spanish were doing that Britain said we have to be involved. We have to be, and not just be involved. If we're going to get involved, we'll get really involved, right? We're going to take over. And like Jamaica is a really good example where it was a Spanish colony at first. Spanish were the first people to enslave and take Africans to Jamaica. By 1655, it's the English Navy takes over the island and then really establishes itself as a foothold and kind of becomes the premier slave trading nation in the world. And it is based on this kind of transition into really seeing Africans as not being fully human. That our life doesn't matter. That's why even the 21st century we're saying Black Lives Matter, but that really is a legacy from that time.
That's something that I find quite interesting as well, because if we look at history, we know, we know that the British and Europeans were all over Egypt, and Egypt is clearly Africa, although they've tried to mystify us and say that it isn't. And they knew that they found untold knowledge in those areas. So how easy was it for them to then, turn around and go, oh, well, actually, even though we've seen and we know all of this, we're going to change our minds and say that you're not quite human.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because Europe, 1492 is kind of like the kind of dawn of the West, and things start to change. Columbus sails the ocean blue, discovers America, even though it's going the wrong direction, right? Thought it was going India. At that point, Europe was behind everywhere. The only part of the world in a dark age was Europe, literally. Africa had civilization for thousands of years. The Americas, civilization for thousands of years. China, and they were behind, and they knew they couldn't have pretended they were, because it was obvious they were behind, right? And like you said, Egypt, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Egypt is advanced civilization because of the pyramids, etc. There's lots and lots of evidence. And what basically happens is, and this is why, again, it takes a couple 100 years to really do this, is they rewrite history, like totally and utterly rewrite history. Egypt becomes not part of Africa. It's that's where you get the term sub-Saharan Africa, which is a term we should always reject, because what they're basically saying there is North Africa is not really Africa. Egypt's not really Africa. You couldn't possibly have had that civilization. That's then sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, Dark Africa, as they called it. That's really where Black people are. And in order to do that, they just have to rewrite all the history books. to the point where even so when Columbus's time, it's the Arabs who have got the kind of dominant in that region in terms of and not just Arabs but Muslims and even the Africans in terms of like Muslim scholars in like Timbuktu, etc., are way ahead. Way ahead. They've written all the books. And what the Europeans do is they translate the work from Arabic into Latin. They change the names of the Arabic scholars who wrote the stuff and make them like sound Greek. And then that becomes the body of knowledge which 16th century, 17th century used. So it's quite possible that they genuinely thought that they were white people. But that was actually a process they had to go through to kind of erase it and make it look like white people were superior.
Is there any truth in the ideas that a lot of libraries and educational formats were burnt down by the Europeans?
Oh, 100% true. Timbuktu, ransacked, burnt down. The Moors, the African Arab Moors who took over Spain, half of Spain, civilized Spain as well, by the way. Like a lot of the stuff that we talk about as Western civilization, cutlery, toilet roll, this kind of stuff, that's all from the Moors, right? They take it into, and the Moors take it from Africa. So it's like the Arab kind of invasion into Africa in the 7th century, and then they kind of invade into Spain. But this is all the links of this is really African civilization. And one of the first acts, and it's not a coincidence, 1492 is important because that's also the year that the Spanish defeat the Moors. And when the Spanish defeat the Moors, one of the first things they do is they burn 2 million books in a public, it was Seville, 2 million books in a public square in Seville to erase Arabic. After they'd translated everything into Spanish and pretended it was Latin, but they actually did. They burnt so much. They just destroyed. And across the African continent, you can see they've done that to make it look like we have no civilization, no contribution to science, etc.
I mean, at that point, England really was quite an insignificant place, even alongside Europe. You know, when you're looking at how did Britain end up being the driving force on the whole slavery conversation?
Yeah, as I said, England is behind everywhere. Remember, England's a tiny little place. I mean, it's not, it really is a small little place in the Atlantic that doesn't really have much to offer, right? And has to slowly kind of build its way up. And it's really through naval supremacy. The English kind of invest, again, learn from the Dutch. Actually, the Dutch, and this is part of the thing when we think about that period, we tend to think of different nations and they're competing, which is true to some extent, but they were also really collaborating. So when there were technological advances, for example, the Dutch became the premier kind of shippers, they shared those with the English, who then became the premier naval, and because of the sea as well helps. And so because England was able to create this really big navy and really powerful navy, it was then able to, you know, build, expand, take colonies in the Caribbean. And, you know, the wealth really is the Caribbean. If you want to look really where does England get its wealth from, it's Caribbean. Barbados, the first British slave colony, then Jamaica. And that expansion, the money that comes from there, so much, it enriches British industry and commerce, and then Britain's eventually able to become, you know, the center of empire.
That's another question, because we know that those, you know, especially when we're looking at what's happening at the moment, the structures that were developed at that time to assist the slave owners or slave masters or whatever you want to call them, really were developed in this country and taken into the Caribbean. And they're still kind of quite, you know, we're still living by them now. How much was known by royalties and government empire? You know, how far into it were they?
No, totally, completely. Come on, there. It was, like I say, it was Queen Elizabeth who was launched, who said, look, go and do slavery. And all of those royal families, it was who sent off Columbus. It was Queen Isabella. The elite knew exactly what they were doing. They did it on purpose. They knew what the benefits would be. And they were well aware of what they were doing. And one of the things we really understand this history badly is we don't, you know, we separate the Caribbean or India and Africa, the colonies, from Britain. And you can't do that. Like the Barbados, Jamaica, they were part of Britain, part of the empire. They were just actually more important. You could make an argument that particularly the sugar colonies in this period are far more important to British development than anything that happens on the island. So they knew what they were doing. They knew who they were exploiting, and they knew it would bring them untold wealth And it did. I mean, fair play, I suppose. That is what built what we have today.
How many of those, of the offsprings of those, are still in our government today?
Well, the royal families that kind of inbred patronage that goes on and on. But also, if you look at the so that when they ended, so in order to end slavery, the government pays the biggest ever, and it still is the biggest ever payment to private industry from the government. It's 40% of the government's whole entire budget at that time, which now would be about, what's it called, 600 billion, some crazy number like that. It's a massive amount of money. 5% of GDP, which would be about 100 billion in today's money, went to the slave owners. And the University College London have tracked where that money went. At the time where David Cameron was going into Jamaica and saying, you're not getting reparations, move on from slavery, David Cameron's family benefited from those payments. David Cameron's wife's family is even worse. See, her father, I think it was, her like great grandfather, had loads of money. He was one of the main people who took payments from slave compensation. And that does go a long way to explain why they were running the country at that time.
Boris's wife as well?
Yeah, I think Boris's wife, they're all there. And even that underestimates it, because that's just, descendants of people who owned the enslaved at the time. But the government don't give out that amount of money to an industry unless it's absolutely essential to the country. So everybody in the UK at that time was benefiting from slavery. Absolutely everybody is. And the wealth from that is with us today. And really importantly, the poverty from that is with us today as well. If you want to explain why places like Jamaica, where my family's from, are so poor, there is no other way to explain it. In fact, we shouldn't even be there. The only reason we're even there is because of slavery. So when we talk about things like reparations, it's frankly insane that so that payment the government made was so large in 1834 that they had to take a loan from the Bank of England. But it was so much money, they only paid back the loan in 2015, which essentially means through our taxation, my grandmother, whose grandmother was enslaved, was paying compensation to slave owners.
I've been paying taxes my whole life for the past 20 odd years now, if not more. So that's
we can at least get that money back, right? At least, come on, at least give us that money back.
I definitely agree with that. I want my money back. I don't want to pay none of that kind of thing. Right. Well, just a last question. One, I want you to tell me quickly about your book, because I know you've got to run off as well. And we're going to see you later on in the discussions as well. But where, what do you see as the future? What do we need to do to change things? Or do you think it's going to change?
Okay, I always try to be positive. I just finished another book, actually. So in February, I've got a book coming out called The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. And the feedback I got from the publishers was, can you end it more positively? Because it was really negative. I'm like, this is really bad. And my part of my response was, actually, that book is a prequel to Back to Black. So the book that comes out is basically, it's terrible, it's really bad. Racism is just, things are different now, but they're not better. It's the same logic. It's the same problem, right? So it is really bleak. I'm not going to lie. So it's bleak. But Back to Black, the reason I wrote it, because Back to Black is kind of the more, what do we do? How can we positive? Where do we go forward? But I think people generally need to understand this, just how deeply ingrained this is. And we're not having, when we talk about racism, particularly in this country, it's so much on the surface. I mean, and I'm partly guilty because I go on TV and talk about, I don't know, what was the last thing? Rule Britannia and all this nonsense stuff but we just have this really surface level conversation. And a big part of the thing is we need to start understanding racism properly. That it is, whiteness is is the political economy. That our life literally is literally worth less, which is why COVID hitting is more likely to kill us, obviously, because that's our location. So I think a big part of that is understanding that. And then what Back to Black tries to do is says, if we keep doing what we have been doing, it's not going to get better, right? Because what we've been doing is just making things worse in many ways. And so we really need to say, to rethink, to restart, to say that we can't be about just reforming what the system is, because the system isn't broken, right? The fact that COVID is more likely to kill us doesn't show the system's not working. That just shows you how the system works, right? So that means we need to start thinking of proper alternatives, right? There is 50 years ago, we were talking about revolution and Pan-Africanism and da-da-da-da, and that's not that long ago, right? And it was possible that this, where we are today, wouldn't be. We'd have created a different kind of world. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need to start doing, because if we keep going the way we're going, it's only going to get worse and not better.
Unfortunately, I have to agree with you. Well, I've been following your work for a long time now, so keep up the good work. And thank you for being part of tonight's show. And we'll look forward to hearing you in the discussion later on.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.